If you were to be on a desert island, let's say that you were going to be dumped on a desert island for 3 years, who would you take?
Dog.
Dog.
That's a really good one.
All right, well, here's a variation on the theme. One of the things we're going to learn in this week's parasha is the cities of refuge. And the question is, if a person had to go run to a city of refuge, who do they take? So just put it into context.
Sorry, were they allowed to take somebody with them?
Well, that's what we're going to see. So what's the city of refuge? That's a story with a person who inadvertently lands up killing somebody. And because it's not murder, they can't be prosecuted. But because they killed somebody, they have to go through a process of atonement. And the Gemara tells us that golus mechaperes, that a person being exiled from their personal environment, that is a means of atonement. So we take this person away from their home, away from their community, and they go into this city of refuge, and that will help them to atone, and they have to stay there until the Kohen Gadol passes away, which could be any amount of time. They could be there for a few months, they could be there for a few decades, depending on the circumstances. There's no telling, right? So let's assume that the person's going to land up in the city of refuge for a number of years. They've got to live. Let's be practical. They've got to have an income. They've got to be able to have access to regular amenities. So the question is, what do they need in order to be able to live? So the Torah tells us, or at least the Gemara in the assessment of the story of the Ir Miklat, of the city of refuge, which, by the way, had to have a population, besides obviously the people. I mean, how many people do you think there were in Gunson who ended up going to a city of refuge because of their behaviors? I mean, it must have been a small amount of people. There had to be a population. It's called a city. And we're told that the tribe of Levi would live in those cities. And there were other people who had to live in the city. And we dafka tried to find a population that was a very positive population, people who'd be a good influence. So in order for a person to go to the city, it's very interesting. The halacha is the city has to have access to drinking water. Okay, it makes a lot of sense because the person has to be able to obviously survive. And there have to be markets, implying that the person has to be able to have some kind of income. Can't just go to a city like that. Yes, the person's in a bad way and therefore they have to go through this exile. But it's got to be a livable environment. So what's considered a livable environment? Who do you take with you? This is a fascinating halacha, and it might dissuade any person from entering the rabbinate. You know, like my grandmother always used to say that a rabbi is not a job for a good Jewish boy. And this would be a good example of that. So the halacha is, the Gemara tells us, that if a student has to go into exile, his rabbi has to go with him. Nebuch, the poor rabbi. What did he do wrong? You know, he's going to go. So imagine, you go to the desert island, who do you have to take with you? Your rabbi. I can assure you, most people who land up on a desert island, the last person that they want is the rabbi. So, two shuls, exactly. One for the rabbi and one for exactly. So, but it's a fascinating halacha, don't you think? Here you've got an individual who obviously has to go into exile because they did something really bad, and yet they schlep along the rabbi. How does that work? So the Rambam comments on this in his laws, as he does, the laws of the Ir Miklat, of the city of refuge. And the Rambam says something very interesting. He says, Balei HaChochma, people who are masters of wisdom, Umevaksheha, and people who seek wisdom, for them life without Torah is not life. Now, what does that mean? So you have a look. The original verse that tells us about the city of refuge says, "V'nos el achas he'orim ha'el," that the person who killed this individual should run, literally flee to one of these cities, because there are various cities all over the land of Israel, because there has to be easy access. V'chai, and the person will live. Now the simple understanding of what that means is, you have to expect that the family is going to want to take revenge against this person for having killed their family member. And you don't know what people are going to do. There are vigilantes out there, and anything could happen. So the Torah mandates that if this person goes to that city, that's a protected space, and they have immunity. Nobody's allowed to touch them there. So v'chai means that you go there, you live. You don't go there, it's open season. Anything could happen. In fact, the halacha is so interesting because should the family take vigilante action, they are technically not liable for murder. We're not encouraging it. It's not appropriate behavior, but we won't try them for murder because we understand the emotional turmoil of family members when somebody's been killed, which is an interesting topic in its own right. So the only way that this person can live, v'chai, the only way that he could live is he's got to go into the special protected space, and nobody's allowed to touch him in that space. Says the Gemara, no, it's not just v'chai that he has to go into a place where he could survive. V'chai means that you have to give him midi tahavelei chayusa. You have to give him the opportunity to have a life, not just to live, to have a life. And it's based on that the Gemara says, make sure there's drinking water, make sure there's economic opportunity, because without that he's not living. Says the Rambam, that's not the only component of Jewish life. It's not just that you should have food on the table and you should be able to drink and you should be able to do some business. Baalei Chochma, people who are masters of wisdom, Umevaksheha, and people who seek wisdom, if they don't have Torah, that's not a life. So therefore, the guy's got to have his rabbi.
But hang on a second. Surely there are other rabbis there that he could have brought.
Okay, maybe it's a good point. Maybe there's other rabbis. Find a new rabbi, you know. Maybe find a new. Good question.
I think his point is there would be a local rabbi.
Exactly, be a local rabbi. Why do you have to schlep this guy's rabbi? Think about it. Nebuch, the poor guy, he's probably got a shul of 500 people, and one person makes a mistake, and it's the end of his life. He's now going to go into the Ir Miklat, into the city of refuge, and that's where he's going to live now, because he's going to be the rabbi of this guy. Doesn't make any sense. Does it sound fair?
But he goes to the city of refuge because it was an accident, wasn't it?
Yes.
So, I mean, he could have been a tzaddik and he could still be a...
Oh, good question. Good question. Right? Well, I don't know if you're asking it as a question, but you're making an observation. But that's a good point. It's possible, theoretically, that the guy who inadvertently kills somebody else is actually a good guy. He's actually a tzaddik. And now now unfortunately, because of circumstance, he's got to land up in this city, and therefore his rabbi has to suffer.
It's the rabbi's family and the whole congregation.
Exactly.
From that rabbi.
I don't know if the congregation has to go with necessarily. The congregation
No,
can
but
stay
no,
home. They left without a rabbi. Okay, maybe he's not a congregational rabbi. Maybe rabbi over here means that he's a teacher in a yeshiva. Okay, so now the yeshiva doesn't have a rabbi. Whichever way you look at it, this is a public personality who's committed himself to the community, and because one guy in the community, I had to land up being that rabbi who's got that guy in the community who ran a red light and knocked over a pedestrian, and that's it. That doesn't sound right. Doesn't make any sense. How does it even work?
With him allowed out the city of
Oh, good question. Is the rabbi who goes with him allowed out of the city? Hold that thought. We're going to have to examine it when we get to that point. We're not even at that point yet, right now, which is at the point of why the rabbi? Why is the rabbi getting schlepped into this? So now, you've got to ask yourself something else as well. When the Rambam tells us that people who are Baalei Chochma, who are masters of wisdom, that they have to be able to have wisdom, otherwise it's not worth living, do you think that every single person who inadvertently killed somebody was always a Baal Chochma? Never. There's a whole spread of humans. Some of them might land up in this situation and still be scholars. Some of them might land up in this situation and not be scholars. So is the Rambam here only speaking about a person who is a scholar, and therefore Nebuch, this poor guy, can't live without his fix? He needs his Torah, and I say it in a respectful way. Obviously, he needs Torah. This is real for him, and therefore he needs his rabbi. And maybe it doesn't also apply to other individuals who maybe are not such Baalei Chochma, who are not such great masters of wisdom. Maybe that's what he's saying. So we've got to understand over here: is the Rambam speaking across the board? Because in the Gemara, it definitely seems that way. The Gemara says as long as a person has the status of Talmid, that means that the person is still studying under a rabbi, which we should all be doing our whole lives, then the Gemara doesn't seem to distinguish between what kind of a Talmid. It just says generically that if a person who is a student has to go into a city of refuge, then the rabbi, who is the teacher of that student, has to go with him. The Rambam seems to fine-tune this and say, well, it's specific to those people who value wisdom, those people who are masters of wisdom, those people who seek wisdom. So is the Rambam telling us something possibly different to the Gemara? In other words, We've just got to understand what is the reality. Is the reality that every single person who's a student has to have his rabbi go with him? And then the question is, why? Why would the rabbi have to go with him? So now let's talk for a moment about this business of being a tzaddik. Okay? What do you think are the chances? Do you think the chances are higher, lower, or the same for a tzaddik to accidentally kill somebody? Do you think it's higher, lower, or the same as the rest of the population?
I would say lower.
Lower. Okay? Why would you say lower?
Because he doesn't do the general things that the man in the street would.
Right, he behaves in a different way. A person who's a tzaddik behaves in a different way to the ordinary, and therefore the likelihood is that he has lower chances of exposure to reckless, dangerous, negligent behavior. He just behaves differently across the board. Okay? It's a very good point. So let's try and think of a scenario. How could, terrible accidents happen, let's be honest. And terrible things happen where people who are ordinary citizens, innocent people, land up in terrible situations. So why is it that you imagine, and by the way, we didn't say we had tzaddik, we just said Talmud, that this is a student, or we said Baal Chochmah, that this is a master of wisdom. We didn't necessarily speak to their character, we just spoke to the fact that they have an interest in Torah learning. So let's just think about this for a second. So we have a principle that says, Lo ye'uneh letzaddik kol oven. That if a person is a tzaddik, Hashem prevents them from mistaken, inappropriate behaviors. So, for example, there was a story, and I can't remember right now who it was. It was one of the Hasidic Rebbes. He once went to a person's house, and they brought out the meal, whatever the meal was, and there was some item, either it was a piece of meat, or it was a soup, or that had meat, or whatever it is. And he, for whatever reason, he said, thanks, but no thanks. I'm not going to have it. A while later, in the middle of the meal, and this is the kind of story that used to happen in those days, the butcher comes hurtling through the door. He says, I hope you didn't eat the meat. There was a mix-up in the butchery, and we sent you the wrong piece. Came from the animal that afterwards we checked the lungs and we discovered it's not kosher. Said to you, I hope you didn't eat it. Obviously the family's horrified, but doubly horrified because they have this big Rebbe at the house and they just offered it. And he declined the meal. Why did he decline the meal? He himself didn't know why. He just had this feeling, not for me. So Hashem protects a tzaddik from even an inadvertent avera. Right? It's an interesting concept. Not only that, and this is a harsh one. There's a pasuk, there's a verse where King Solomon says, "Mereshoim yeitzei resha," that bad things happen through bad people. It's a very heavy line. Now that has many applications. For example, I'm trying to remember again. The story just came to my mind right now, so I don't remember the details. But there was a story during the Holocaust where there was a group of young boys who were taken to a gas chamber. And inside the gas chamber, they started singing, Ashreinu matov chelkeinu. How fortunate we are. So the guard was very agitated by the fact that they were singing. So he opens the door and he says, what are you singing? No, we're singing how fortunate we are. He says, how could you say you're fortunate? He said, you're about to be gassed in the gas chambers. How can you say you're fortunate? He said, we're fortunate that we're not you. In other words, rather be the victim of the crime than the perpetrator of the crime. Mereshoim yeitzei resha. Bad things come through bad people. Hashem selects who he's going to use for which particular task. We have another expression. The sages use an expression that when Hashem has something positive to bring to the world, he'll choose a person who deserves to have the merit of bringing something positive to the world. And when, God forbid, Hashem has something negative to bring to the world, he'll choose a person who, because of their demerits, deserve to bring something negative to the world. Which means, this is why it's such a harsh thought, which means, obviously, criminals will commit crimes. Obviously, you don't need King Solomon to tell me Mereshoim yeitzei resha that criminals will commit crimes. That's obvious. That's basics. What he's telling us is that Hashem, if Hashem allows something horrible to happen through an individual, what that individual has to do is they have to look in the mirror and say, why did this happen through me? Not to me, through me. Why does the person who kills inadvertently have to go to the city of refuge? Because the person needs atonement. Something bad happened. And that bad thing happened because of them. Not because of their choice necessarily, not because of their malicious intent. It happened because of them. The person was driving the car, they hit the pedestrian. The pedestrian ran into the road, and Hashem decided for whatever reason that that pedestrian had to be hit by a car and killed. That's all true. Why did it have to be my car? You know, I have a similar thing with the law of what we call a ma'akeh. You know what a ma'akeh is? It's a very important principle for safeguarding a home. That according to halacha, a person who builds a house, you have to put a guardrail around the roof. So in those days it was common to have a flat roof. You have to make sure that you have railings around the roof so nobody can fall off the roof. The practical application for us is, if you have a swimming pool, halachically you have to have a fence around the swimming pool. If you have a staircase, halachically you have to have railings on the staircase so nobody can fall. And the Rambam says not only that, but it's any hazard that a person could have in their house. You have to ensure that you safeguard any hazard in your house. So when the Torah tells us about this, it says, you have to put a railing around your roof. Why? Because we're concerned, ki yipoil hanoifel mimena. Because we're concerned that a person, hanoifel, who will fall, yipoil, will fall off your roof. What's the Torah telling us? Hashem decided that this person has to fall. That's their destiny. It's very unfortunate. Every person has a particular destiny. This person's destiny is to fall off the roof and die. But it didn't have to be your roof. So you have the responsibility to safeguard your roof. Well, Hashem's business is Hashem's business. So coming back to our story, the person has to go to the city of refuge. Hashem decided for whatever reason, so-and-so has to die through these unfortunate circumstances. There's no escaping that. That's what Hashem decided for that person. But there's absolutely no reason it had to be me. The fact that Hashem chose an individual, that they should drive their car into that pedestrian, means that that person needs spiritual rehabilitation. They've got to work on themselves. They've got to do teshuvah. Golus mechaperet, to go into a state of exile, to be removed from your environment, is an atonement process that illustrates the person needs atonement. So now I ask you, is the person going into the city of refuge a tzaddik? What are the chances? The likelihood is that who's going into the city of refuge? Somebody whose life is not so you know? I'm not saying that, I don't even want to use the word deserve it, but they were skating on the edge. This is somebody who, for whatever reason, created in their own world a vulnerability to something bad. And the only way that can happen is through a person's conduct. That's the likely scenario of who's going into the city of refuge.
Sometimes when people do something like this, they actually turn to religion.
That is true. So it's a catalyst and it's a wake-up call, etc. And we're hoping for that in this person's case, because we're hoping they'll be in the city of refuge, which is supposed to be a very encouraging, positive, spiritual environment. So we're hoping that it's going to make a big difference to them. But before they go, they don't sound like they are the highest, most spiritual person in the community. So now the Rambam says, you know who needs their Torah infusion every single day? Balei Chochmah, masters of wisdom. Umevaksheha, people who are seeking wisdom. Doesn't sound like this guy. If this guy was a master of wisdom, he probably would not have landed up in such a horrible situation. If this was a person whose life was the obsession of learning Hashem's wisdom, that probably would have protected him. So where does the Rambam get this from? That you've got to send the scholar, the teacher, along with the guy into the city of refuge, because the guy is not going to survive. And the Torah says, V'chai, he has to be able to live over there. He seemed to have lived quite fine without this level of spirituality, because if he had this level of spirituality, he would never have been in this mess in the first place. So how does this work? So one of the suggestions, it's a bit of a difficult suggestion to wrap your head around. One of the suggestions is teachers have to be in touch with who they are teaching. And we have a principle that the Gemara teaches. If you discern that your student is what we call Talmid She'enoi Hagun, which means an ill-suited student. In other words, the student doesn't really behave properly. Get rid of him. Kick him out of your class. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? This is going to go down well in the modern educational system. My little uncle, you're telling me he's a Talmud Sheino Hagan, and we're going to kick him out of the class. Well, really, what the Gemara is saying is, if a teacher cannot get through to a student, then it becomes a liability for the teacher. Because if the teacher can't get through to the student, and then the student does something which is inappropriate, who gets labeled? The teacher. It's your guy. This is your prodigy. This is your student. Why didn't you get some values into him? And so there's a view that says the reason that the rabbi has to go with the student into Golus is because the rabbi should have got rid of the student. And he didn't distance himself from a student who behaves inappropriately. So now he carries the responsibility for everything that happens because of that student, and he's got to go through a rehabilitation himself. How's that for a thought? Is that the beginning of the end of the story? No, it's not. But there's a thought for today.
But this doesn't sound like it implies that the guy